We were just talking. This is not at all like that time when you... Dana caught Dan's gaze and stopped. Almost 4 years of marriage meant that Dan and Dana knew each other quite well, or at least he thought so. They were at a small party, he lost sight of her, and found her outside on the veranda talking to Doug, the person he disliked more than anyone in the world. Dan thought he saw the signals, her hand automatically brushing her hair back, her overly animated hand movements while talking. Dana often moved her hands when talking to someone, and momentarily unnecessary touching of her hair was another habit. Dan knew this, but to him at that moment she looked like she was interested in the man. It was already annoying enough that Doug had success with women, far more than any other man Dan knew. But he just acted like he thought he was better than everyone else. In high school, it was Doug who scored the 2-point conversion goal that gave their team the season title, so he was the hero. Dan himself scored 2 touchdowns and stopped a turnover that could have been a point when the opposing team's player intercepted a poorly thrown pass. The pass was thrown by Doug. Heck, his pass was 20 feet too long and way off the line. Dan saw the runner dart to his right, then break through another player and get free. Dan caught up with him from behind and knocked him down. It almost ended the game. It was on the 3-yard line. On the very next play, Dan snatched the ball from another player's fingertips in the end zone. But Doug was still a hero because of those 2 points. And of course, it was Doug who made a last-second 3-pointer to send the basketball game into overtime, thanks to a perfectly timed pass from Dan that was covered by 2 players from the opposing team at the time. Nobody mentioned this part. Dan also ran track and was a pretty good half-miler. There he could shine. There was no way in hell Doug could have kept up with him as he tore through the final corners. The school record of 1:58.9 was in Dan's name. Mile no, Doug, of course. Yes, it was also Doug who stood up at graduation and gave a speech as a valedictorian. Dan's average was a B, and it was far from close. It seemed to him that the guy always treated him like a non-entity. This irritated Dan. Well, not really, he was always pleasant, but that's how it felt. But he also kept his mouth shut, keeping the peace. Because Doug was always smiling and happy, there was never any reason to just hit the guy. Fine. There might have been some jealousy there, Dan just couldn't avoid it. He didn't like Doug. The fact that Doug dated Dana their entire junior year didn't sit well with him either. He also dated many other girls, so Dan made his own moves as well. He tried and tried with her with little success. Dana simply seemed captivated by Doug's good looks. He was tall and thin, blonde hair, blue eyes, that damn grin that always made him look like a man with something in mind. Dan's slightly shorter stature was also stronger, his dark hair and eyes with heavier than usual eyebrows, giving him a more rugged appearance. He had no problems with girls, but the one he really wanted was out of reach. Until late one evening during his senior year, when Dan and Dana met, it was almost by chance. It was a warm fall evening, and he was riding his bike when Dana rode up to him. They rode together for a while, then stopped at a cafe to drink soda. Dana really showed interest, so he asked her out, and she accepted. He always wanted to know what she and Doug did on their dates, but he could never bring himself to ask without fear of seeming stupid. Did they kiss? More likely. How far did Dana let Doug go? It was there in the background, like a damn tiny stone in my shoe. So that night at the party, when Dan told Dana for probably the 20th time that he didn't like her being around that guy, she exploded at him. Doug is just a nice guy. We were just talking. And of course, she mentioned Sherry again. Ever since they got married, every kind of disagreement without exception resulted in a mention of that incident at a much earlier party when Dan lost control after drinking a little too much. In fact, it was much more than just a little. That party over 4 years ago was just like all the others. Everyone was young and full of energy. College students are usually like this. Dan and Dana had been dating for many months and had finally developed a just the two of them type of relationship, which didn't fit well with everything that was going on. Most of their friends had sex regularly, But all Dan and Dana had done up to this point was kiss a lot. She let his fingers explore inside her bra and even rub her through her panties. But she resisted anything more. Finally, when their sessions in the car reached this point, she would unzip his pants and ease him. Dana really seemed to enjoy it, her breathing coming in short, ragged breaths, and she moaned softly as he ejaculated. Dan asked her if she ever did this with other guys, but she denied, saying that all she did was make out a little. Dan believed her to some extent, so he didn't bring it up. His own experience was somewhat limited, so he assumed hers was too. After all, she was his, period. That's what he told himself, even when he wanted to know what it was like with Doug. The truth at the time was that Dana was the only girl he'd ever gone that far with. Although one day in the hayloft, a local girl named Paula showed him her breasts to tease him and then ran away. Strangely, this case always popped up in his head when Dana was dealing with it, without exception. He saw no point in mentioning it. It was something that happened early, excitingly, but best kept under wraps. He knew he loved Dana. She told him she loved him too. They even talked about what it would be like after college. So everything was fine until that damn party. One of the girls there was named Sherry. She was one of those girls that could best be described as gorgeous. Barely 5 feet tall, she was gifted with a pair of breasts that were impossible to ignore, and Sherry was well aware of her effect on men. Her tops, without exception, showed a lot of cleavage, and her jeans seemed to be painted on her rather round ass. There were a few stories about Sherry, but Dan chalked it up to bragging. Guys often did this when there were no girls around. Sherry was by Doug's side most of the time. Doug's family owned a chain of auto parts stores, so he always drove the latest and greatest sports cars. Another irritation, Dan's old Ford was clean and shiny, but it was still an old Ford. Doug played guitar in a local band, which also made him a magnet for girls. He liked to force the amp whistling from the feedback to the rhythm of the heavy drums like it was something special. Dan tried this at home himself, and it was easy and just noise. He liked country songs much better and loved watching the audience start stamping their feet when he played and even sang. Of course, instruments were brought out at parties. Dan played quite well himself and somehow replaced guitarist Doug that night. "Try to keep up," Doug said with a sideways glance as he picked up his guitar and joined in. Most of Doug's music was rock, a lot of Creedence, good old Led Zepp, Rolling Stones, and the like. Dan had no trouble coping, of course. A couple dozen couples were there, and it got to the point where the louder the music, the better. The beer was flowing, someone brought a huge bottle of vodka, and Dan sipped it. Doug, of course, soon leaned his guitar into the amp, creating feedback that to Dan was just noise. Then Doug took a break. The guy on the drums sat lazily drumming in rhythm while everyone drank and talked. Dan switched to a simple country song and walked up to the microphone. By the second verse, everyone was quiet and listening. Dan's voice was made for country music, and he knew it, and soon everyone was either dancing or tapping their feet. He noticed Sherry looking at him and then walked closer to the corner where they were playing. It was hard not to look at her. The thin and very tight top she was wearing outlined her chest. She then started bouncing on her toes, which made it even worse. After a few tunes, he saw Doug coming. The guy picked up his instrument and gave Dan a disdainful look. "Let's play real music. I can't stand this crap anymore," he said with a tone that was most likely a grin, but even so he kept his crooked smile on his face. Dan shrugged and put his guitar down, letting Doug do his thing. Somewhere in there, he lost sight of Dana. At one point, he was sitting on the couch with 2 other guys who were smoking. Clouds of smoke surrounded him anyway, then Sherry walked over and squeezed onto the couch next to him. That was the last thing he really remembered. The morning was painful. Dan opened his eyes, having no idea where he was. He immediately closed them as the light gave him a headache. Finally, he opened them again, realizing he desperately needed water. Looking around, he realized that he was lying in bed, but where? Turning around, he touched his feet to the cool floor. There was a door there, obviously the bathroom, so he stood up and went there, running water into the sink while he drank it straight from the tap. Noticing the toilet, he lifted the lid and stretched to pee, and then realized he was naked. He'd had dreams before, but never when he was completely drunk. Of course, he had only been completely drunk 3 or 4 times in his life, and now he thought he would never let that happen again. Dan found a washcloth, wet it, and washed himself. Returning to the other side of the room, he found his underpants and pants. His shirt lay on the next chair. He got dressed and went to the window and looked out. He looked at the backyard but didn't recognize it. It definitely wasn't his house, and it wasn't Dana's house. Dan suddenly wanted to go home. He walked through the bedroom door. There was a short hallway. He walked along it and went out into the living room. A middle-aged woman, a little overweight, was sitting in a chair. A man with a half-bald head was sitting in another and reading a newspaper. "Good morning. You must be Sherry's new friend. Would you like to get coffee?" she asked, standing up. Dan blinked at that. He looked at the older man sitting there, who just looked up, nodded, and went back to his newspaper. Was all Dan could say. "Sherry will be back soon. She went grocery shopping," the woman said, handing him a cup. "Sherry?" Dan took a sip, burning his lips. At that moment, the door opened and Sherry entered. "Hey, Danny, you're already up, okay? This is my dad, Carl, and my mom, Sarah. Sit down, I'll prepare breakfast." With these words, she disappeared out the door. Dan sat down on the nearest sofa. "How long do you meet?" asked Sarah. There was a party," Dan managed to say. "It's clear. Well, don't be shy. We are very relaxed about relationships. And don't worry, we put our Sherry on the pill as soon as she reached puberty," said Sherry's mom, not feeling the least bit embarrassed. Dan looked at her in shock. That's when he realized, with an incredible hangover, he couldn't think clearly. Sherry. Somehow he ended up at her house, in her bed. He has no idea how he got there or what happened. Dan jumped up and ran to the bathroom and threw up. He heard Carl mutter something like, "Fucking kids, they shouldn't drink so much." When he left, he excused himself and headed towards the front door. Both of her parents looked at him as if he had just stolen their TV or something. All he wanted was to get out of there. From the outside, Dan knew he was only a few blocks from where he was. The party was at a house not far from this one, and his own house was only a few minutes' walk away. At the house where the party was, he found his old Ford sitting there, the keys dangling in the lock. He sat down, started it, and drove home. "Where have you been, honey?" his mother asked as soon as he entered. "At the party, there were drinks, so I didn't go," he replied. "That's good, honey. Oh, your girlfriend called several times." She went back to mixing something in the bowl. Dana. Oh God, he thought. Dan went into his bedroom and looked at his watch. It was almost 11. He shook his head to clear it. It only hurt. He lay down on the bed and fell asleep instantly. It was almost dark when Dan woke up. He sat down, feeling much better. It was a little after 7. He walked out into the living room and found his mother sitting there, watching the news on TV. "There's stew on the stove, and you need to call your girlfriend, honey. She seems really angry at you," she said. Dan didn't want to talk to Dana at all. He imagined what would follow. Finally, he called, and what he expected followed. She was furious, demanding to know what happened and what he was doing. He broke down and told her that he was so drunk that he ended up sleeping at Sherry's house and didn't remember how it happened. This damn bitch, you slept with her, didn't you?" Dana shouted. Dan told her the truth. He doesn't remember anything. This seemed to calm her down a little. Then he told her that there was no way he could do anything. He was Tujin. A lie, of course. He was quite sure of what had happened. She seemed to believe it for a few seconds, but then she exploded again. Dan asked her where she had gone, trying to change the subject, but she yelled at him that when she came out of the bathroom, she found him missing and Doug drove her home. When she asked again if he slept with that bitch, Dan said he didn't remember. "I don't remember any of this," he protested. "Nonsense," Dana shouted and hung up. The truth was that he remembered some things, how Sherry took him to her room and undressed him, how she almost gave him naked dances. The rest was fog. He was sure that there had been sex, but how he coped in such a state, he had no idea. He knew one thing: he had probably lost Dana. After several phone attempts where she refused to even talk to him, he was sure of it. Then he heard that Dana had moved to her grandmother to study at medical school. A few days later, he met Sherry and she tried to start a conversation, but Dan made it clear that he didn't want to talk to her. Sherry simply shrugged and walked away. A whole year had passed and Dan was sitting on a short concrete wall reading one of his engineering textbooks. His first year in college was normal and he again had a straight B grade. Several women showed interest, but he ignored them. "Hi, Danny." He knew who it was before he looked up. Of the day. "Hello, I'm glad to see you." He smiled, hiding the sudden rush that ran through him. God, how good she looked. She became even more beautiful, which did not harm her slender figure at all. It all started again, right there. Within a month, they were an exclusive couple. Within 6 months, they were one of the few married couples on campus. She hadn't mentioned that party during that time, and he had no reason to, so he hoped all was forgiven. The past is the past. It's better to leave some things behind. They talked about waiting until marriage before having sex, but that didn't happen. About a month before the wedding, they made love. It was so easy, so natural, that Dan thought it was destined. Since then, they have done this at every opportunity. He never even thought about protection, and neither did she. For some reason, she didn't get pregnant, even though it was a daily occurrence. She started taking the pills just a week before the wedding. Dana never mentioned that party until a month later when he picked up his guitar and started playing "Knocking on Heaven's Door" just to stretch his fingers. "That's one of the songs you played at that party that night," Dana said. He glanced at her. She had a sour expression on her face. Dan didn't know what to say. This was the first time Dana had mentioned it. She then stood up and went into her bedroom, locking the door. The next day, she acted completely normal again, so he forgot about it. He studiously avoided playing this song if it was at home. Dan soon found a job, graduating with an engineering degree. He planned to continue his studies to get a master's degree, but a job offer came in that was too good to refuse. They talked. Dana would have a very good income when he finished his studies. Then he could go back for his master's if he wanted. This meant money, which they had hardly had until then, and they soon bought a modest 2-room house in the suburbs. It was closer to his new job, but more than 60 miles from college. Dan wasn't sure why Dana chose this particular house, as it complicated the situation. She often stayed overnight near the college, sometimes even for a couple of days, instead of making the long journey. Payments took up a huge portion of his income, so they decided to put off having children until after Dana had completed her training to become a registered nurse. This period was difficult. She often spent 24 hours in training, some of which were even longer. Their schedules clashed, and Dan was home alone for days at a time. Even on her short weekends, they did not coincide with his work schedule, so she simply slept in the educational institution, saying that many other girls did the same. The only arguments were when sometimes the topic of that night came up. Then Dana would start to sulk or become angry. Angry to such an extent that she remained in the educational institution, although she could have been at home with him for several days. Several times, about once or twice a year, she used this as an excuse to go to her parents, who now lived more than 1,000 miles away. Dan didn't really mind a few days alone, and he knew it would end soon since Dana only had a few months left. When she was home, she always longed to be near him. It was like a few days of wonderful time, then separated again, as if they had been together as long as they had been apart. Then one day, while Dana was away, he happened to meet one of the guys who was part of the party crowd in the old wild and crazy days. His name was Ben, a chubby but cheerful guy who somehow managed to attract more beautiful women than even athletes could. Dana went to see her mother, so Dan readily agreed to Ben's offer of a drink. The bar was familiar to him. He often spent time there, but he drank little. They were on their second beer. just talking about all the craziness of the past days when Ben asked about Dana. How are you getting along with her, you lucky bastard? Ben asked with a smile. Fine. She can be capricious, but she runs the house well and takes care of me, Dan replied, not wanting to mention that most of the household responsibilities fell on him. I'm sure so, Ben grinned. What do you mean? All the guys wanted Dana, she's a real beauty, Ben said, reaching for his mug. Yes, that's exactly right. I took her out a couple times in the month after you two broke up, you know, Ben said. Is it true? I didn't know that. Dan felt himself tense. Ben caught his reaction instantly. Relax, we didn't do anything, not really. What do you mean, not really? Dan asked. Just kissed a little, nothing special. She didn't let anyone. You understand. Except for some things, he laughed. Ben then caught Dan's expression. But hey, most girls did it, it was just the way it was. Then, when I found out that she was pregnant, I thought it was from you. His voice broke off. Dan looked at Ben. Pregnant. Do you mean she was pregnant? Yes, you knew about it, didn't you? No, I didn't know. Dan stood up. Oh shit. Hey, sorry, buddy. I guess I should have kept my mouth shut. This is nothing. We all got confused with someone back then, one way or another. I was sure it was from you. She only talked about you all the time. I thought so. But what happened? Do you mean she gave birth? Don't know. A couple of days later, she was gone. I heard that she had gone to medical school. That's all. Damn it, everyone was sure it was from you. Dan looked at Ben for a moment, then left and drove home. He sat down in the chair and thought about what Ben said. Pregnant? What was Ben talking about? Dana had been home for 2 days, and Dan had thought about the conversation he wanted to have with her 50 times already. I met Ben the other day, he finally told her. Whom? She asked, her face blank. You remember Ben, he was often with us in the old days. Ben? Oh, Ben Carlton. How is he? She asked. Dan saw the question in her eyes. Okay, I think. He said you met him several times. Yes, we met. I dated several guys after you and I. Dana looked at Dan carefully. We didn't do anything. What did he tell you? She asked. He said that, but he also said that you were doing something, Dan replied. Dana blushed from ear to ear. Yes, it's true. You know how it is with guys. They pester you all the time. It was easier that way. I did it with you too. You told me you never did this, Dan said dryly. Dana blushed even more, and a painful grimace appeared on her face. Sorry, Danny. I didn't want to upset you, that's all. We weren't together then. I didn't think we ever would. I guess I was just looking. Are you angry about this? No, not really. But he said one strange thing. Which one? He said you were pregnant. Dana blushed brightly. Oh my God, she burst into tears and ran to the bedroom. Dana, we need to talk about this, Dan called through the door. She didn't answer. After half an hour of trying to talk to her, with no response, Dan lost his temper, left the house, got into his car, and drove away. Finding a motel, he rented a room and spent a restless night. She didn't answer when he called home the next morning, and she wasn't there when he arrived. He checked the cabinets, almost everything was there. A call to her mother's house caused even more unrest. Her mother coldly said that she did not know where Dana was. Then her father answered the phone. What did you do this time? He asked sharply. I didn't do anything, Dan replied. I'm already tired of this. I told her not to marry you because you will cheat on her again. I swear, if you hurt my Dana again, Dan hung up. There was no choice but to go to work if he wanted to keep his job. But his thoughts were far from work. Pregnant, said Ben. There was almost a whole year when he didn't see Dana at all. What happened? If it was true, how could she hide it from him? If Dana had a child, where is he? And this, of course, could not be his child. Searches everywhere possible over the next week yielded nothing. Dan called everyone he could think of, but no one knew where she was. On Saturday morning, he was about to hire a private detective when suddenly Dana's car drove into the entrance. "Where have you been?" he asked sharply. "I was visiting friends," she replied. "Who?" he asked. "I'll explain, but right now we need to talk." She looked determined. She sat down on the sofa. Dan sat in a chair and waited. "I had a baby girl," she said. "I already understood this part." "I should have told you, but I was afraid of how you would react," she said. Dan could see that she was having a hard time staying calm. "Darling, we weren't together. Everything happened. If you would just tell me." He began. "This is worse, Danny." She looked down. "How could it be worse? You just should have told me that's the problem." "She's Doug's daughter," she blurted out. "Doug," Dan felt shock wash over him. "It happened that night at a party. You disappeared, I asked everyone, but no one said anything until one of the girls said that you left with Sherry." She looked at him. "Oh God," he muttered. "I made a decision. I decided to let you. I was ready. I even bought it. And you—" She began to cry. Dan just looked at her. "Doug, he and I don't know what happened, really. He drove me home, then he kissed me, and one thing led to another. I even forgot about the protection in my purse." Now Dana's face looked like she was about to cry. "Doug, to God, not him," Dan said. I know, dear. That's why I never told you. I was terrified." "Damn it, I'm your husband." "Yes, I know, but let me finish. When I found out that you and Sherry—" Dana paused for a moment. "I was angry with you and felt terrible at the same time, and we broke up. Then I found out that I was pregnant. I didn't know what to do. Doug was kind to me and covered all the expenses. Mom and Dad sent me to my grandmother. I gave birth to Danielle. Doug was upset that I called her that, but I wanted to." "Where is she?" Dan asked. "Doug got custody. You know, he's not really a bad guy. He just has confidence and always gets his way. But he treats her well, and he took over raising her so I could go back to school." "Understand. But 4 years have passed, and this is how I find out about it. How could you continue communicating with him? It didn't last long. I moved when I started, becoming visible. Doug paid all expenses. He was even there when Danielle was born and asked me to marry him. I decided to agree because it would be better for Danielle. But then I met you when I transferred to another college, and I realized that I don't love Doug, I love you." That's when it came to Dan. "You said you were with friends. You meant Doug, didn't you?" "Yes." Dan is already up. "Danny, no. We didn't do anything. I couldn't do it. I just wanted to be with Danielle, and like I said, Doug really is a good person." "Of course he is good. I can only imagine. All the times you were gone, you probably had sex with this couple of him." "No, he gets married. My daughter will live in good conditions. That's what's best for her," Dana replied. "Getting married? Who will he marry?" "On Sherry. She has changed, she has grown, and now they are happy. Danielle will be happy, and they say I can come visit whenever I want." "On a visit? It's been 4 years since you." Then it dawned on him. Every time the conversation turned to Sherry, Dana went to her parents. "More than 1,000 miles," she said, "and all those extremely long shifts at school. You used all these stories about Sherry as an excuse to visit your daughter, didn't you?" "Yes." "At Doug's house, right?" "Yes, but we didn't do anything. Nothing happened. I was just visiting." "I don't think I believe you." "This is true. After I met you again, Doug and I never, ever again. I'm really sorry, Danny." Now she was crying quietly. "I think you need to leave. I need to think about it. It's too much, Dana," Dan said. Dana stood up and walked to the door. Then she turned around. "I'm really sorry, Danny. I really love you. I will never keep secrets from you again." Dan just sat there while she walked out to her car and drove off. Dana refused to accept anything other than her car, although at the last meeting with lawyers, her lawyer insisted otherwise. Dan finally looked at the lawyer and told him in a stern tone to shut up. The lawyer blushed, but made no further objections. Dana signed the papers, looked at Dan, then stood up and left without a word. Dan just went back to his job. For several months, that was all he did. Finally, he started dating. The few women he met were interesting enough for him to bring them home. Both failed, and he returned to working long hours, coming home in the evenings, cooking dinner, watching TV, and going to bed. Tired of being alone, one evening he was looking through the advertisements and noticed one about a massage. The woman named Carla who came to his door was pretty, and the $60 fee quickly turned into $120. It worked without requiring any effort to build relationships. She visited him once a week, and Dan could lose himself in his thoughts. Without exception, these thoughts returned to Dana and how she felt in his arms. A couple of times Carla asked him if he wanted her to be topless or even completely naked. He simply shook his head. Carla seemed surprised, but accepted everything as it came. Several months passed. Then during one of her visits, he asked her directly if she would be willing to do more. Carla smiled and quickly undressed. Again, nothing happened. Later that evening, Dan finally relaxed and lost himself in his fantasies. His thoughts were about Dan and how everything had happened. His life stabilized in this rhythm: work, home, weekly sessions with Carla. There was almost nothing else. Immersed in his work, Dan's efforts were noticed, and he was promoted to regional manager. This was accompanied by a significant salary increase, many benefits and stock options, as well as regular business travel. More than 5 years had passed when he walked into the conference room in Dallas. Usually everything went smoothly, but this time it didn't. He had to stay for a couple of days. He got a hotel room and rented a car. The next morning, he had breakfast at the hotel and got into his tiny rental car, heading to the factory. As he drove through the intersection, he didn't even notice a large white van that failed to stop at a stop sign and crashed into the side of his car. Sveta. They were bright, right in your face. He squeezed his eyes shut, then slowly opened his eyes, adjusting to the light. "Good morning, sir." "We woke up, I see." An elderly woman in white clothes stood and smiled at him. "Where am I?" he asked. "You are in the hospital. You had an accident. You had to have surgery and things were a little shaky, but you'll be fine now." "Great. I need to get out of here. I need to be in the office." "You're not going anywhere, and besides, you've already been here for 10 days, honey." 10 days, Dan tried to sit up, but couldn't. "Just lie still, darling. I'll call the doctor." With these words, she left. Dan felt sleep overtaking him again. An elderly man came in and woke him up, then talked for a long time, explaining that he had a coma, swelling of the brain. As the man spoke, he felt his left ankle throbbing. He reached out to rub it, but found nothing. "What?" Dan felt shock running through him. "Yes, we couldn't save your left leg. We installed a pin so that when they fit you with a prosthesis, you can walk," the doctor said. "Jesus Christ," Dan exclaimed. "I'm really sorry," the man said. It sounded almost automatic. Dan was upset all day, feeling sorry for himself. Here he is, in a hospital in a foreign city, 1,000 miles from home. His life is now a complete nightmare. Unhappy, he thought about what else could go wrong. He even thought about committing suicide because there was no point in it. By evening, he had come to terms with it. There was nothing he could do. He felt better. The fog in his head cleared. "Hey, Danny," said a familiar voice. He looked up and Dana walked in carrying a tray of food. Dan felt a surge of emotion run through him. So much time had passed. He had thought about her so many times, and now she was here. "Dana, what are you doing here?" he asked. "I work here. I've been here for several years. I'm your night nurse," she smiled. "Wow," he said. "I was here when they brought you. It was a surprise. I've been here every night since then." She covered the tray and carefully lifted his bed so he could eat. "What brought you here?" he asked. "I saw an advertisement for nurses, so I applied. I wanted to get away from all the memories and start my life again." "I see." Dan looked at her as he ate. She gained weight quite significantly. The slender young woman now had a more mature and fuller figure. He noticed her blush when she saw him looking at her. Married, he asked to change the subject. No. Is it true? I thought. Well, work and Daniel take up all my time, she replied. Daniel? I thought Doug and Sherry had custody? Doug gave me custody back when I asked. I told him I was moving here and I wanted her with me. He didn't mind. She's 14 now. Wow, it's hard to believe a decade has passed. Dana took the tray, left, then returned with a small basin and towels. I need to wash you and turn you over. We need to move your legs and keep your circulation going, okay? Okay, Dan watched as she worked his legs, lifting his half-burnt left leg and massaging the muscles. It hurt a little, but not much. Then she began to wash it, very businesslike. As she pulled his hospital gown back, she carefully covered his private parts with the towel. Dan held back a laugh. Why didn't you marry? Dana asked. I never met anyone I wanted, he replied. Dana simply nodded. She quickly finished and covered him with fresh blankets. If you need something, just press the button, she said. That night Dan had dreams of times long past. The rest of his stay was similar. Finally, he was in a wheelchair and sent to see a specialist. It only took a couple of days to get used to the artificial leg. The only real problem was constantly shifting my weight to stay upright. He quickly learned to use his right leg to maintain a stable upright position, and after a week or two of practice, it was difficult to notice that he had a prosthesis. On the last day, Dana was there when he was taken out to a taxi. Dan stood up, looked at Dana, and extended his arms to hug her. She hugged him back. On the flight home, he couldn't stop thinking about the tear he noticed on her cheek before she quickly turned away. Returning to work, he often thought about Dana. After 3 days, he couldn't stand it anymore. Hello? A young girl's voice answered the second call. Can I have Dana? He asked. Dan was pretty sure it was Daniel. Mother, they're calling you, he heard her scream. Mom's upstairs now. She'll be down in a minute, okay? She returned to the phone. You're Daniel, right? Dan asked. Yes. Who are you? She asked. My name is Dan. I was married to your mother. There was deathly silence on the line. Who is this? He heard Dana's voice in the background. It is he, Danielle whispered. Who? Danny, she said louder. Then came muffled voices, as if she had covered the phone with her hand. Hello, Dana's voice sounded excited. Hello, this is Dan. I was wondering if I could invite you to dinner. There was a short pause. Yes, I would really like that, she answered quietly. Can you pick me up from the airport? I'm arriving today at 6 in the evening. Yes, I will come. Okay, see you later. Dan heard giggling in the background as he hung up. Dan walked to the tram that took him to the exit and saw Dana waiting for him. Standing next to her was a taller, slightly darker-toned version of the Dana he had known in his youth. The girl smiled widely. Dan hugged Dana. She responded, but was a little reserved. Dana skillfully drove the car through the chaos of traffic. In their apartment, they sat down and began to talk. Danielle was quiet at first, but soon began talking about school and everyone in the world. He thought it would be a problem considering she was Doug's daughter, but it wasn't. Danielle turned out to be a lively, bright, and healthy young girl. Dan noticed the look that passed between her and her mother. Danielle soon excused herself, saying that she had to get ready for class. Dana looked at her watch. Why don't I cook something here? She asked. I'd like to take you somewhere, Dan said. I'd rather just chat, she smiled. Okay, but I have a room booked in the city center. I can just take a taxi there later. No nonsense, my couch folds out. You can stay here, Dana smiled, looking down for a second. It's been a long time, Dana, Dan said. I know. I keep thinking about what could have been. Me too, she said. Dan stood up, and so did Dana. He held out his arms, and she pressed herself against him. It felt right. The sofa was never laid out. His artificial leg only got in the way until Dana helped him take it off. At some point, Dan heard the door open, then quiet laughter in the corridor, and the door closed again. That first night felt almost like old times. Dana's body had changed, but somehow it was still the same. He was sure she was thinking the same thing. There were no performance issues. The next morning, Dan woke up, and it took him a few seconds to remember where he was. He heard quiet voices in the other room, but could not make out the words. "Good morning, sleepyhead." Danielle smiled brightly at him as he walked out. Dana was sitting at the kitchen table with her daughter. She smiled and stood up to pour him some coffee. "What time is it now?" he asked. 11:30. We were already thinking about calling 911, Danielle joked. Dan sat down and began to drink coffee while Dana prepared breakfast. She placed a plate in front of him with a huge stack of pancakes, eggs, and bacon. "When do you have to leave?" she asked, sitting down at the table. Dan noticed the look Dana and Daniel exchanged and didn't quite understand it. "I took a vacation so I can go whenever I want. Why do you ask?" "About. It's just that Father Daniel is supposed to come this afternoon. They meet regularly." Debt. Instantly memories came flooding back to Dan, but he held back his reaction. "It's clear. It's not a problem. I can just rent a room." "No need. Doug and Sherry usually take Danielle and go somewhere. You can stay here if you want," Dana said. Dan nodded, but he really didn't want to see this man. He was still feeling uneasy when there was a knock on the door in the afternoon. "Hi, Daddy." Danielle hugged the man. Dan looked up and was surprised. The tall, handsome Doug he knew was now a balding, slightly pot-bellied man with glasses. It took him a few seconds to realize that standing next to him was Sherry, now gaining about 50 pounds. They shook hands, and the three quickly left the apartment. Dan couldn't help but laugh as soon as they left. "What's so funny?" Dana asked, leaving the other room. "Oh, nothing special. I was just expecting. I don't know what I expected." Doug has changed, they both have changed, but they seem to be happy together. They now have 4 children. 4? Yes. Daniel goes to visit them for a month every summer. Doug is a really good person. He sends us money regularly and loves Danielle. He's been a part of her life all this time. This is good. All this was a long time ago. I told him you were coming when he called the other day. He always knew." "Knew that?" Dan asked. "About you. When he asked me to marry him and I refused, he asked why. I told him it's because of you and I can't. I just couldn't." Dan reached out and hugged her. Dana rested her head on his shoulder. "You know, he told me then that he was always jealous of you. That's why he tried so hard to be better." "Jealous of me? Why? It was amazing. Because of everything. You were always better. And then he found out that I love you. We really messed it up then, didn't we?" "Yes, they ruined it." "Well, we have the whole apartment to ourselves," Dan smiled. "It's true," she smiled back. Somewhere around 9 o'clock in the evening, Dan heard voices. He could not make out the words, but knew that Doug and Sherry had brought Danielle. They quickly left. Danielle walked to the bedroom door and knocked softly. "Mother?" "Yes, darling," Dana asked. Is he still here?" "Yes, darling." Danielle giggled and went to her room. "She's growing up," Dana said. "Yes, she's beautiful." "So what are we doing here, Dan?" Dana asked. "How about you give us another chance?" "I would like that. No more secrets, I promise. And you can even see your friend Carla if you want." "I don't see why I would. I'd rather you take care of me," Dan smiled. "Fine, I'll love it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next